when I did this drawing and sample painting back in November, I think it was, I had my ellipses on these arches very rounded, almost like ovals. And Lois, if you want to spotlight the down the drawing so that we can see that a little easier, because there's a lot of people on a lot of thumbnails up there. There we go. And when I pulled this thing out a week ago, I realized that it would make this whole facade look really flat. And to give it that perspective, it needed to be squished together, these two ellipses. So as you kind of zoom in on these, you can maybe see in my drawing where I erased a little bit and made some adjustments. If you feel like you need to make those adjustments, please do now while I'm talking, and I'll keep talking and you won't miss anything. But what happens is when you put the value on these, and when I say value, that's the color, all of a sudden mistakes in our drawing just jump out at us. And we don't always see these things, when we've done a sketch. So I try to be fairly accurate with the sketch, but then when I put the watercolor pigments on, I loosen everything up so that it gets a little looser and looks a little more spontaneous. But at any rate, it's important to get these things accurate to make it feel like it's receding off into the background with perspective. The other thing that I wanted to point out is I'm always very conscious of the variety of shapes in a composition. I always want to have a dominant shape, some medium-sized shapes, and then some smaller shapes. And the medium and the smaller shapes are all there to support the dominant shape. The dominant shape is over here on the left, and it's this big facade of the building. And we have these other similar but not the same type of shapes that are architectural. And then we just have some very loose vegetation here in the background. It's kind of stylized. It's not trying to be, accurately copy the reality. I want to make it more painterly. So I tried to just keep this a nice dark shape to make these negative shapes of the buildings come forward. Anytime you put a dark shape behind a negative shape, it's going to make that negative shape come towards the viewer and make it feel much more important. The other element that we're going to be talking about today is water reflections and the atmospheric effect of rising mist. These are hot springs. So we want to feel that moist heat that's coming off the water into the air. And so hopefully you've got some soft Kleenexes or tissue available, because we're going to be doing a little bit of blotting later. We'll use a lot of water in here. We'll even have a little mist bottle where we can spray this to soften things. But think about variety of shapes, a dominant shape with supporting shapes. We're going to be working, as far as our palette goes, primarily with yellow ochres, warm yellows like gamboge, Indian yellow. Those are basically the same color. And then the stone colors down here would have some ultramarine blues with raw umbers, some earthy sedimentary colors. The darks in our reflections for the water will be phthalo blues, a little bit of burnt sienna. We'll have some pops of yellow ochre within that water. But when we do the water, it'll be very wet on wet. So we have that feathery, soft effect. And we'll paint water vertically so we get those reflections to show up as vertical reflections. And then later, while this is just starting to lose the shine, I can come through with the edge of a flat brush and lift a little bit of these little ripples that you see in the water. So that summarizes where we're going to be going with this. And hopefully that gives you a little bit more of a comfort zone on how we're going to approach all this. Again, yellow ochre, new gamboge, yellow, Indian yellows. I use a transparent orange by Schminke to get these nice kind of warm oranges that you get for clay tile, roof tiles. So that's it. Now, I'm going to set the painting aside, and we will focus on the paper here with the shapes that I put in.
Randy, can I interrupt you for one moment?
Sure.
He's asking you, what is the focal point of the painting?
The focal point is going to be, this painting is about near. Everything in the distance is going to get a little softer, a little bit more distant and not focused. We want to see what's right up here in our foreground, in our laps as the viewers. We're looking down into some deep water that's going to have some richness to it, some really dark darks. And then we've got these really bright facades of the architecture right here of these buildings. So we're painting these hot spring spas that are in the center courtyard of this village or city in southern Tuscany. And we want to play up this building right here in the foreground. So the arches will be very well defined. The steps will have some sunlight kind of tickling the top of the treads. The brightest bright will be right in this left-hand building that's in our foreground. Everything else kind of supports that. So that being said, what I want to do is use a fairly large, I've got this inch and a half brush, and I'm not going to necessarily wet this shape, but I'm going to have a lot of water on my brush, and I'm going to pick up some yellow ochre in my palette. We'll get a lot of yellow ochre. I'm going to mix it right up here in this center well, and then I'll get some gamboge and add to that to give it some brightness. And I want to have plenty of water in that mixture, but I also want to have plenty of pigment so that I have enough to get through the whole shape. So you can see there's a big puddle there. I'm going to set this over here out of the way, but I've got my brush has this water mixture of paint well mixed into it. And I'm just going to come down across this facade, and my board is at a slight angle. So the water should start beading up as it rolls downhill. And I'm not trying to get a perfect wash. I'm going to leave little areas where it collects and beads up against the dry paper. And that's going to help give me a variety of textures on this building. I'm dropping in some more yellow ochre now into this wet surface. And I'm going to get a little bit more of the gamboge and come right across these windows. And I'm going to leave a little bit of a negative shape for the planting. There's some little plants on that balustrade that incorporates the, I don't know what you call it, the entryway. I'm going to actually create negative shapes out of the stairs. And I can do this pretty quickly with a flat brush. You can see how this is just really beading up. So I'm going to tip my board back and get some of that water and pigment to flow back into the facade. And I will go ahead and do these other nearer balcony facades as well. But and I'm just coming down to the cap of this stone wall that's in the foreground. And I'm going to get a little bit of raw umber and orange. I'll mix those two colors up and get a little richer orange mixed with my, what do you call it, the gamboge. And you can see how this now starts to get a little darker. And as it beads up along this edge behind the wall, it feels like it's a little bit darker and it's tucking down in behind this foreground stone wall that contains the hot springs. So I'm holding this board a little bit level so that it doesn't beat up too much. But you can see how this little enclosure with the arches feels a little darker, a little warmer than the facade behind it. And I'm just rolling my board a little bit to let this water move across that surface. But I'm keeping that orangey tint to it just in this forward facade. I'll come in a little darker behind this area right up in here where it tucks in behind that door as well. Maybe right up against the stair treads. Get a little darker. Now, while this, I'm going to probably wick up some of this so I don't lose, so it doesn't roll over that stone cap on the stone wall that's in the foreground. But as I set my board back down onto my angled surface, I'm going to pick up a little bit more raw umber and a little bit more of the orange. And I'm going to, because my facade is still pretty damp, I'm going to drop in just a little bit of this darker pigment on my brush, and we'll just kind of feather that around this lamp fixture, leave that as a negative shape so it stays a little brighter. And I'm just going to pull some of this down at an angle so that it just is a little warmer on the far left side. That warmth makes it feel like it's coming towards us. I can even use a little bit more of the gamboge, which is a brighter yellow, warm yellow. And we'll just let that dry. And I'm going to stop here and let you do that. So if you haven't already started, go ahead and do this, but watch out for this bead that's collecting at the base of the facade. Don't let it dribble over the top of your stone cap on the wall that's closer to us, because that is needs to be left lighter as a negative shape so it reads later. But I'm just going to add a little bit darker pigment into my wet surface right over here to the far left side of the painting, so it feels like it's very, very close to us. And we'll just let that dry.
Randy, I've got a question for you.
You can actually see the reflection of the light on the surface here. That tells you how wet it is over here on the far left. What was the question, Lois?
The raw umber is darker brown for somebody than yours and less yellow. I want to know what brand you use.
You know what? I had a very difficult time finding a brand of raw umber that I liked. And I ended up going to Cheap Joe's American Journey. Out of all the raw umbers, I've kind of settled on that I like the best. And you're right, there's a raw umber seems to have the biggest variety of or ranges in color. Some are really brown, some are very cool and greenish brown. I like to consider raw umber to be a clay color that's got some coolness to it, which would mean it needs to have just a little green undertone to it, as opposed to raw sienna, which has a sandier beige tint to it. And finding that requires a little bit of experimentation. But you'll find one that you like, you'll settle on that, and then I encourage you to stick with it, because I use raw umber as a base to mix a lot of colors, and having the right tint to it is important to me. Now, while you're doing this, I see what happened here at the very top. Everything pulled away from that overhang, and it's starting to dry. So I'm going to just touch it with a damp brush and feather that right back in up underneath the overhang of the roof, so that I don't have that drying as a kind of blemish on there. I can also, while you're working with this, at some point while the paper is still wet, get a little bit of burnt sienna on this same brush and add a little bit of ultramarine to it, and that'll darken it, but it'll keep it warm. It just takes it down in value to a really nice dark cinnamon color. And I'm just going to come in underneath my overhang of my roof with just a little bit of dark here, but I don't want it to run all the way down into my facade. This is a shadow. I just want to have kind of a soft surface. So I've leveled my board. I put a roll of tape underneath the bottom so that it stays nice and level. And we'll let that just have that really nice soft edge. Well, I'm going to come in and just kind of pick up a little bit of that edge and actually add a little bit of the gamboge right up underneath that roof to give a little bit of glow or reflected light going back up underneath. So we can stop at that point, let this dry. So it's I want to, while you're painting, I'm going to take my heat gun and just try to get some of this water to evaporate a little bit. I'm going to tip the board back so all the dark goes back up underneath the roof overhang. And we'll let this just very gently dry. And that should give everybody plenty of time to work on getting this facade painted. And if this is a little bit blotted or mottled, on the surface of this stucco, that's okay, because that's the texture that we want to see on this facade. And I'm just using just a slightly damp brush with a little drier paint to come in and add here and there just a little bit of warmth in a few places. But you have to wait until the paper has lost some of the extreme shine of being wet before you can do this. Otherwise, it's just going to run everywhere. Now that my paper has started to dry, I'm going to come back in on this little facade that's closer to the viewer than the building's facade. And I'm just going to darken this just a little bit to make it feel like it's closer to us. It's subtle, but it works. And I'm going to come in on my little risers with this flat and just kind of drop in some color, some value, leaving a little tickle of white on the treads where the sunlight is giving us a little bit of what do you call it? Sparkle. And right underneath that tread, the lip of the tread, I'm adding just a little bit of dark with the edge of my brush here, just to kind of accentuate the fact that these are risers tucked in behind this parapet wall. All right, that does it. Now I'm letting this kind of dry with the heat gun while we're talking so that you really can feel. And I'm adding a little bit of the gamboge up in this shadow, just so it feels like there's a little bit of reflected light. And we'll just let this dry. Now, while you're painting, I'm going to talk a little bit here. The next building back, that's right in the center of our painting, the facade that's facing the hot springs is going to be lighter in value than this facade that we are just painting now. It's the same material, it's the same light, but because it's farther away, it should be just slightly lighter in value. The excuse me, the surface of the building that's facing us is going to be darker to create a separation between these two facades. So we'll have a little bit darker in here. This will be lighter than this because it's receding away. So that's where we're going next. And once we get that done, we'll come back in and add some glow and some shadowing to those arches that are underneath the parapet wall. But I just wanted to prepare you for where we're going next with the middle building that is back behind this first one. I think you can see mine's pretty blotchy, which is actually kind of nice because that's the way stucco is. It has picks up different reflections of light based on the texture of the surface. And I'll come back in and we'll put some plants on the top of this parapet wall. We'll get some shadowing in there later, but don't try to paint around your doors. Don't try to paint around your windows. We'll just come in with darker pigment once this is dried, and we'll just give little suggestions of doors and windows to suggest the changes in that plane. But if you try to leave big chunks of white, it'll look like the windows and doors have been pasted on. So just always just paint right over everything, and we'll come back in with darker pigment once this is completely dried. Okay, when you're getting ready to start this next sequence, if you want to mix up with your brush more of the exact same lightest value, we started with a little bit of yellow ochre and just a touch of new gamboge or gamboge, which is Indian yellow. And you might want to add just a little bit more water. The extra water will lighten it in value. It'll be the same hue, but it'll be a lighter value. And rather than trying to create two shapes here, I'm going to paint everything. I'm going to start with the exact same color all the way across both facades. And I'm leaving a little room for where the plants are in that courtyard. But you can see I'm just going to paint the whole thing the same color and we'll let that dry. And I'm just going right up underneath the roof. But you can see that's a little lighter in value than the one we did on the left. We'll let that dry. So if anybody has any questions, I can repeat that, but that's a very small shape, but I want to give it time to completely dry before we go to the next step. So fairly simplistic approach. And I'm just going to hit it with my heat gun, let it dry. And you notice how dark my pencil lines are? That means I've got to come in with a really dark value to cover that pencil line up. And I'm going to let it get lighter as it moves back to the left, tucking it in behind this other building. So I'm going to be pretty dark right along that corner that's facing us, but the paper has to be completely dry in order to do that next step. So I think you can see the difference in value. They're the exact same hue, but this has a whole lot more water in it than this did. This is more saturated. This is less saturated, more diluted. Same hue. And I always test my paper with the back of my finger to see if it's dry, and it's still wet. So I'm going to hit it with a hairdryer a little bit more. And once I'm satisfied that that's dry, then I'll go back in and pick up a little bit more of the raw umber and some orange. Raw umber and orange is darker in value, and it's still warm, but it's going to feel more like a shadowy shape because of the change in value overall. And again, I'm going to come in around these plants, tuck it in against this wall. Now we can't really see that pencil line, can we? I'm going to rinse my brush and get a little bit more yellow ochre on it and start working my way over to the left, and I'm just rinsing my brush and getting less and less pigment on it. So it gives us a nice gradation. And I might even add just a little bit of burnt sienna in here, right up in this upper corner, just to accentuate that change in light and shadow. Maybe down here behind this plant a little bit. Okay. You notice that shadow is it's very wet, so it's going to dry 50% lighter. But right now it looks about the same as this shadow underneath this roof line. And we're going to give it a chance to dry and see what happens with the value. It'll lighten considerably. But right now it looks pretty good. I might even add just a touch of ultramarine to that, right up in the corner underneath the roof. Take the rolls of tape out from underneath this board so it goes back to a sloped angle on my work surface, and let that darker color just kind of run down and blend and mingle. The cools with the warms are mingling together and giving us a really nice soft transition. Let me zoom in here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. That's literally a huge puddle of water. And I'm just going to give it a chance to move across the surface, tip the board a little bit, let some of that water move the pigment across the surface of the paper so that we get a really nice blend that's very natural looking. It won't have any brush marks in it. I'll come in later and put windows in, darks, and you don't have to worry about that right now. But just getting those value changes is so important. While this is dark, I'm going to take some of that dark and I'm going to pull it right up underneath this this overhang. Get a little bit more orange in there so it feels less dark and more of a glow. You want that shadow underneath the overhang to be done at the same time that this shadow side of the form side of the building is in there. I'm going to take a smaller round brush. I'll show it to you here. It's just a medium-sized round. And I'm going to mix up a little bit of cerulean blue with some raw umber and a little turquoise, light turquoise, cobalt turquoise, to get my plant color. And I'm just going to come right in up against the edge of this building and keep my negative shape of that lamppost. But I want the top of my plant greenery color to actually be soft up against that lighter facade that's in the corners. And I'm going to come in right around this lamp shade or this street lamp, and then just add a little bit of green, not too much, a little viridian. Viridian is very, very strong. So I like to use the turquoise and the raw umber. I think it's a more natural feel. And just let these wet shapes touch each other. The warms and the cools of the green will touch each other and give us a softer edge. I can always come back with a drier pigment and drop in a little bit of dark around this lamppost to accentuate the shape of it so it pops out. But there's our separation that tucks this planting back in behind this important building on the left, the dominant shape. Just done with a little bit of cool color, touch of cerulean blue and raw umber, and I can always add just a touch of the yellow ochre, and it will repel some of that pigment and make it lighter. As I'm progressing through this painting, I'm going to continue with these facades over here. I'm not going to do the one down here because I want to do that at the same time that I do the water. But the facades on these upper buildings over here on the far right, they're not going to be as defined and crisp as these buildings on the left, but they will have a lot of the same color. This value that we have on this one sunny facade in the middle is pretty much where we want to go over here. It's the same light. It's going to have about the same value to it. So it'll be a diluted down yellow ochre and gamboge. Once I get these facades in here, I want to come in with my sky and bring the sky right on down and then paint the darks over that sky once it's dried. So just keep that in mind as well. Now, you've already mixed up with a brush that lighter value. I don't know if you still have it in your palette, but it should be fairly easy to get back. I have in my palette, I'll show you my palette here. I have a big puddle of it right here. It's just mostly water, just a little bit of tint to it. But I can use that. That's more than adequate to get started with this facade. And I'm just going to come right across all of this and just bring it right on down to the roof lines, tuck it in behind the roof. And I'm just going to add a little bit of water at the bottom so it's not really defined. I'll come back and get a little bit more yellow ochre in this center area and just pull some of this right on across. It's very wet. It's running down. And I'm not going to do much more than that with it because I do want to come out to the edge of that corner. But that's it. That's a pretty simple way to handle that. It's a small, quick brush stroke. Remember the adage with watercolor: he who makes the least strokes wins. So you want to get in and get out. Don't overwork it. Just leave it. If you've got little bits of beads of water coming down, collecting, that's just texture. That's nice. You want that to be your goal. So I'm going to come in on the dark side of these here in a moment, but I want to let this dry first so that we've got, or at least lose some of its wetness. It's very shiny wet right now, and we'll let that have a chance to kind of settle. So I know most of you are probably moving pretty fast through this part because it's not real complicated. But if you've got a hairdryer, I would recommend that you dry this quickly so that it's not real wet. It might be a little damp, which is okay, but you don't want it to be real shiny wet. I'm gonna see, that's already pretty dry. I didn't by going in with mostly water, once that water evaporates, the little bit of value that's left behind is very faint. The lighter values makes it feel more distance. The darker values, like you see over here on the left, makes it feel closer to the viewer. I'm going to take this little center recess that's in the middle of this building and make it just a slightly darker value using the exact same material. Now there's a balcony in here, so I'm going to get this a little darker, and I'm going to come underneath it, and then there'll be a little recessed area there that I'm going to add a little bit of my orange, my burnt sienna. We'll just kind of throw this in here right up against that edge, so it feels like there's a little bit of a shadowy area. And then I'm going to come back in here with a little bit of dark underneath this. We'll come back in underneath this overhang and just drop in a little bit of warm burnt sienna to suggest where our shadow is. These roof overhangs extend out over the building a little bit, so they create this nice little shadow. And I'm going to take a little bit of cerulean blue and come back up and capture the shadow side of this building as it comes down. The same over here. We're going to have a little bit of cerulean blue with some of that burnt sienna in it, and it will just give us a cooler side. And while that's wet, I'm going to add just a little bit of yellow ochre up here at the peak of each one of these on the back side. It will warm it up and feel like reflected light on the back side of that. Okay, and then underneath, we can take a little bit of cerulean blue and burnt sienna and just add a little bit of shadow there, a little bit more of the burnt sienna, drier burnt sienna, not real wet, and drop it in here where this archway is. And this is just a drier drop of dark paint into a damp surface, and it feathers out. It's just not real defined. It's just more or less a suggestion that there's some depth and some things happening back in there. We don't know what they are. If you try to define it too carefully, it draws our eye over there. So you don't really want to draw the eye. You just want to suggest that there's some things happening that are a little darker. I'm going to get just a little bit dark in a couple places in this archway there, just to suggest that there's stuff going on. Because my surface is already dry, I'm going to take a little bit of this cerulean blue and just put just a suggestion of some windows. They don't have to be perfect. And I'll add a little bit of the orange in parts of this. I think that's about all I want there. Remember, leave it alone. Now we've got a chimney up there. If you have some more of the same facade mixture, just go ahead and add that to the shape, because it's the same stucco. We've got it over here on this building. While you've got it on your brush, just do this as well. And it's just a lighter value. And then I'm going to take just some dry burnt sienna and orange and create a little clay stack at the top. All right, that's it. Look how fast we did these buildings. You don't have to overwork it too much. It's if you try to do too much, it just looks kind of stilted and stiff. Putting a little bit of that chimney cap orange right in the peak of these little roof areas in the shadow, just to give it a little bit more dark. Come back in with a little bit more dark underneath the overhang. All right. We'll let that dry. And then I think we'll because most of us work from the top down, so we don't drag our hand through washes, we'll do our sky next. But for the sky, it's not really the most important thing. So I'm going to keep it pretty watered down. I'm going to take my brush, and I don't know how you clean your palette area. I have a little area here that I'm just going to take a brush and clean my area where I mix. And I wet, all this pigment that was in there is now nice and wet. I'll rinse my brush, wipe it off, take a tissue, and then I can just kind of clean that out, and I'll be able to come up with a really clean wash or glaze for my sky. I've got a nice place to mix it. I don't need a whole lot, but you can see from my palette, I've dedicated a little area here, and I'll probably start with a little cerulean blue, maybe a little bit of cobalt blue, but very watered down. And I don't necessarily want to go back in and make a wet and wet sky. I'll just work with a wet brush and kind of come down and bring it right to the rooftops, come down in between these buildings. And then once that's dry, I can come back in and paint the trees in the background to separate all the shapes of the buildings. But we're going to let this chimney dry. If you have a real big bead of water at the base of this chimney and you want to, kind of hurry it along, just wick up a little of that excess bead of water. It doesn't take much, and wipe it off on a rag. And now it's an even amount of dampness. Take your hairdryer and just evaporate the water, and you're good to go to the next step. So it doesn't take a whole lot to get this to dry. If you're in a real humid location, it might take a little longer, but where I am, it's pretty dry. During the winter, we tend to have a little drier climate, so shouldn't take much to do that. Now, I'm going to swing over to my palette so you can see what I'm doing here. I'll take my bigger brush, and I'm just going to take a touch of cerulean blue and maybe just a touch of cobalt. That's kind of dirty. I must have had some brown in my cobalt. But by adding water to this, I've got a nice wet mixture. I'll come back now to my painting with that fully saturated brush full of, by the way, if you're mixing up a wash, make sure that you work your brush well into that wash. So you've got a fully charged brush that's got lots of the same color pigment and water all through the bristles. Then come down and just start touching the dry paper with this wet brush. And if you push down on the heel of the brush, you're going to skip and leave some areas that are drier on your paper. Those can be clouds. They can be places where the pigment starts to collect up against that dry area as it runs downhill. Can you see how that pigment is running downhill? Gives it a really nice natural feel for the sky, so it isn't all exactly the same. I'm going to add a little bit more water. I'm not worried about my trees. I'm just going to paint around my chimneys, come down to my rooftop, paint right through those tree areas, get a little bit darker cobalt, but it's all wet up here, so it's all going to run. And using a flat, I can control and come right up against the rooftops. Pretty nice. Now, don't go down all the way in between these buildings, because I want to leave a little bit of white paper in there to suggest a fence line. And I do that simply to create a little chatter of negative shapes that break that up. And I can get in underneath my my overhangs here, come in and around these chimney shapes, and use the edge of the brush to come right away from the rooftops, which are flat lines or, straight edges. And I got this bead of water now. I'm going to take my smaller brush, get a little bit darker in here, and make sure that it's all wet, and can just kind of come in against that edge. Now we've got a cool blue going up against these really nice warm facades. So it creates a nice little transition from warm to cool. I'm going to wick up some of this excess bead of water in here. And I'm not going to do anything with that fence there. I'll just leave that like it is, because when I come in with my darks, that's when I'm going to really define that fence. But right now, that sky looks pretty wet, but I think by the time we dry it, it's just going to be barely there. You'll just have a cool, soft feeling to it. So go ahead and take it to that step, dry your sky, and then we'll come back in and start working on the background. All right, my sky is adequately dry. It's a little damp, or a little cool to the touch, but it's not wet. So I'm going to use that big brush again, this big flat that I've got, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of Windsor blue and some raw umber, but mainly Windsor blue, and I'm going to add a little bit of the burnt sienna to that. And if you've got, a touch of some green, any green, doesn't really matter, just to kind of warm it up. I'm going to even turquoise would, like a light turquoise would work. I'm not real wet. I've got a lot more pigment on my brush than I do water. And I'm going to come in right against this roof, and I'm going to create just some real kind of random shapes. And this is pretty dark, and it's cooler up against that light sky. But as I come down away from that silhouette shape, which I'm working pretty hard to keep a really nice dark. If you need to go back and drop in a little bit more of the phthalo blue into it, just to really accentuate the darkness of that edge for these treetops, go ahead and do that. But don't go all the way down yet, because what we're going to do is transition this from a really cool dark to a warmer dark as that tree line and the vegetation and the ground comes towards the viewer. It becomes less cold and less distant and less dark, and it becomes warmer. So I'm just introducing a little bit more of the raw umber to this dark color as we start getting towards the viewer. And you have to kind of play with the phthalo blues a little bit to get to the point where you transition to a warmer color as it gets closer to the near. I don't know how to say that, but as you get closer to the viewer. So now I'm going to pick up more of this raw umber, and you're going to really start to feel more of a warmth as we come down. And then I'm going to actually get a warmer green, like a golden green, down right here behind this little near wall. I want this to be a little more precise across that rooftop. So I'm going to get a little bit of cerulean blue and raw umber. And then now I'm going to come back in and create just a couple of gaps between the rails in this fence. Drop in some darks here and there, just to suggest that there's some chatter, there's some things happening back in here. Get a little lower. So I've got some fence posts popping up, just to break up that big flat shape of the trees behind, and make us feel like there's actually something going on in that background. I'm going to use the water that's beating up here and just pull that up into this shape. So we've got some nice wet darks. And you'll see later, I'm going to go across this. I'll knock down the brilliance of these whites just by glazing over it after everything's dried. But for now, I think we're in good shape. And you can see how that dark that we've established here is just really creates a beautiful negative shape out of these buildings. All right. We want to leave that alone. So it's just one big shape, but within that shape, we go from a very cold dark to a warmer dark as it moves down the hill and comes towards the viewer. And if things bead up here a little bit, that's okay, because what's going to happen is we start losing, that really wet surface. I may take a damp brush and just flick a little bit of water into this shape and let some of the water bloom down lower to create textures that we would see within those trees. It looks like solid black right now, but once that dries a little bit, you're going to start to see texturing emerge as the water does its thing. And I'm going to put a little bit of tape, rolls of tape on this to level it out so that some of that water moves away from that fence back up into that dark shape.
What were those colors again, Randy, that you used for that?
I started at the very top with a phthalo blue. And then as I moved down, I started introducing a little bit of raw umber and got a few darks in a few places, but then added water to it just to make sure that you could see the separation of value between the buildings, which are pretty warm and near. And this darks kind of makes this feel like the dark trees are behind it and in the distance. I'll back up the camera a little bit so you can see how the whole thing works together. And I might even add a little bit of yellow ochre right in here just to add warmth right at the behind this little seawall or little wall that's in the foreground. There. Rinse my brush, put it away, and let it dry. We're going to use that phthalo blue again down here in the water. So it keeps everything unified with a limited palette like this. I think you can start to see what's emerging in this big shape. I've dropped in a little bit of yellow ochre where it was really wet, and the yellow ochre repels some of that phthalo blue. And you get a really nice little kind of suggestion of warm light on this hillside without having to define anything. It's just the pigments repelling each other and creating these nice soft little transitions from cool to warm within that background. It's very subtle, but in the long run, once the painting is done, it's going to really have a nice effect. So just wanted you to see that. I'm going to take this tape roll out from underneath so you can see it properly. And the next step, I think what we'll do is we'll go in and do our rooftops. So I'm going to mix up, I'm going to clean my brush, go to about a 1-inch flat and get some orange, mostly orange mixed up. I've got a little bit of a space here in one of my mixing wells here, and I'm just going to get some of that transparent orange and mix up a really nice rich mixture of orange. And I think there was a little yellow ochre left over in that well, but you can see it's a nice warm orange. And I want to get enough pigment in my brush mixed in there, fully saturated, loaded brush. And then I'm going to come right down across this rooftop here and go right underneath the overhang. And if you come a little bit over into the shadow area, it's okay. Not a big deal. I'll do the same thing with this, come around these little chimneys and just give us a nice tint of that orange. I'm going to get some burnt sienna, my quinacridone burnt orange, and I'm going to add just a little darker value right up here in the upper side of that rooftop. And then taking a lighter, more diluted bit of brush work with the same hue, I'll get the remainder of the building back here in the background over on the right. And I'm just going to pull this right across those shapes because they're dry. Don't need to worry about anything. Pull it down underneath the overhang. So it's part of the shadow. And I'm just glazing right over this. Even that balcony balustrade is covered up because it was lighter to begin with. And now by glazing over it, it just kind of pushes it back into the recess there. But that works pretty well. It went pretty fast. Not trying to, create any magic here. I'm just adding the pigment. And as we start to lose some of our wetness and it starts to dry, I might take a damp brush and pull it up into the sky a little bit to soften this. Might even take some of that background trees and drag some of that pigment up into the sky just to create an edge here. But we'll let the rooftops dry. I stuck my finger in that rooftop and it left a fingerprint. So I know it's too wet. It's still very wet. But maybe that fingerprint added texture gives it character. Now, I think this is dry enough. I'm just going to take a clean, damp brush. And what I did is I take this brush and not over my painting, but over my towels here. I just squeeze all the water out of it so that it's just damp. And I'm going to take this brush and just kind of pull some of that orange right up into the sky. And the same with the green. I want to take some of this green and just make it a little less hard edge there. And you can even take a little bit of a tissue and soften that transition. But it basically helps soften that whole transition of the treetops and the edge of the roof line. And if your trees in the background are completely dry, you can take a little bit of Payne's gray, some burnt sienna, and a little bit of your Windsor blue, probably more Windsor blue than the other. And I'm going to come back in and just create some nice dark in here, just some real random shapes that suggest parts of the trees. And they come down behind this building, nice and dark. And it's like the holes through the trees where the light is just all in shadow. We'll let that dry. It's kind of shiny right now, but it'll look really nice and dark soon. And while this is still kind of oily in consistency, I can drag a brush handle or a credit card or something through this and create some tree trunks back in those trees. Just a slight suggestion where they're hitting, picking up a little bit of light maybe on some of the tree trunks. You can see where I just kind of scraped out a little bit on there. If you look at your screen, you can see what I did. I have a set of brushes that have a bevel on. They're acrylic handled brushes. And I've got some really big brushes with bevels on them. I've got some really small brushes with bevels on them. And because this is so far away, I wanted to use a smaller one, but I have to wait until I lose the shine. The paint is still oily wet, but it's not so fluid and full of water that if I scrape, the water would just flow right back into those scrape things. Envision a bulldozer moving some dirt aside through a hillside of vegetation. It leaves the earth exposed. What we're trying to do is leave the white paper exposed beneath the paint so that the paint doesn't flow back into that little scrape that we just made on the paper. And by waiting, long enough so that it's the papers and the paint are not really sloppy wet, and they're just kind of sticky, oily, I can then scrape that paint aside and it won't flow back, and it just reveals and leaves that white paper peeking through. So it's all about timing. It's not something that is, this is just now starting to dry enough that I can throw a few more scratches in there. All right, the next thing we're going to work on, let's see, where's my painting? Let's finish this rooftop here. I'll get a little bit of orange paint from my rooftop business, and we'll come back in here and get some dark here. Rinse our brush and use this pigment to just pull down with a little bit of a damp brush that's been rinsed. And you see how the roof stays lighter in some places, and some of that pigment is a little stronger in other places. And it just gives a nice kind of light orange indication of where that roof is, because this is getting more light than anything. And I'm going to get this corner defined a little bit with a few little lines of orange to replicate where the barrel roof tiles are. We'll get a little darker right underneath here. There we go. Leave that about like that. All right. We've got this little connecting wall that separates this courtyard in the middle, and we've got the two arches. So those are what we're going to move to next. And we've got two things happening. We want a very warm, shadowy, glowing effect under these elliptical arches. And then we have a stone wall over here that has a little bit more organic look to it. It's going to be lighter in value than the stone wall in the foreground that's holding back the hot springs water. So this wall behind the lamppost and beneath the vegetation is going to be mainly raw umber and a little bit of yellow ochre. So I'm going to mix up a little something here in the side. We'll get a little bit of some raw umber, and then add a little bit of water to that. And then add a little bit of cerulean blue. It kind of cools it down a little bit. And I'm just going to push some darks right up behind this warm corner. And I've got some breaks in that stone wall in the foreground, so I'm going to define those and then just rinse my brush. And I'm going to just take that pigment that I've already got on there and just drag it across with some water so that it goes from dark to really light in the back. And then as we get down into this second little break in the wall in the foreground, I want this to be a little darker so we see that break as an interruption in the straight edge. And I think you'll find that that's really kind of nicely defines how that whole wall works. And that water, I just let the water kind of move that pigment around so that it creates this nice organic blend. I'm going to set my palette down, pick my board up, and allow the pigment to kind of flow across that shape. It's a little bit of raw umber, a little bit of yellow ochre, and cerulean blue. But you see how it's a little bit lighter right underneath those plants? So the plants actually are darker in value. And once this dries, we'll come back and maybe darken the bottom edge of those plants just a hair. But while that's drying, I want to think about where I'm going to go with these two arches. This has got the little courtyard stone wall has more of a cool beige approach, whereas these arches in the beneath the stairs are going to have a warmer glow to them, so more orange and burnt sienna. I'll use a smaller flat for those. This is a little 3/4 inch flat, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of burnt sienna and some orange. The burnt sienna takes it down in value. The orange keeps it warm. Here's how bright that is in my palette. It's quite bright. I'm using quinacridone burnt orange in lieu of burnt sienna. It's a more staining color. It's brighter. It's more vivid and saturated. The burnt sienna right out of the tube is actually a sedimentary color, so it's going to, by its nature, is going to be duller. But now I'm going to use the edge of my flat to come right in underneath the left side of each of these arches with my brightest, warmest orange. And when I say orange, it's more of a burnt sienna. But you can see this is what defines and separates the facade that's facing the water versus up inside this arch. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and just pull a wetter brush full of shape down into this archway. And we'll just fill that in, and I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber in there just to darken it a little bit. And then we'll get some gamboge and orange and allow that to be just obviously darker than the facades. And most of the glow is up at the top. As we get down lower toward the bottom of the interior of this, we're going to add more and more cerulean blue and raw umber to really give us some shadowy darks. And I'm just pushing these darks right up into that wet shape above that has the oranges in it. And we'll just let water move this stuff around so it has a nice kind of smooth transition from warm to cool. I'm going to add just a touch of ultramarine blue down into the bottom part of these, the shadowy part of the arches. And I'm just dropping pigment into this wet puddle of paint and letting the orange kind of move around in that water to give us that glowing effect. And now, if you remember, if I put a little bit of a drier mix of yellow ochre into this, it's going to repel some of these darks. And it's just it's like a chemical reaction. You drop yellow ochre into these darks and they just immediately start reacting and repelling some of the dark. And when that dries, it's going to have sort of an organic look to it. That'll be kind of interesting. We're going to tip my board a little bit, maybe add a little bit of water in there just to get this to run. No pigment, just water. And the water raises the pigment up off the surface of the paper and keeps it moving so that everything kind of blends and has a nice mixture all by itself. And if I want, I might add a little bit more orange with this small brush while it's really wet, and just let that orange kind of move around within those shapes to give it a nice kind of glowing effect. There we go. That same mixture that I just used on the inside of those arches, I'm going to take my my medium round and grab some of that and use that to really cut in right behind this parapet wall on each of these little risers on the steps, so that we feel like there's a complete transition between vertical and horizontal surfaces here. I want these steps to feel, the risers to feel like they're vertical as opposed to the steps that have full light on them that are horizontal. And where it comes down into the bottom, I'm just going to drag some of that pigment right across the landing at the base. Maybe put a little bit of this warmer color of orange in that wet shape there. Put a little bit underneath these little cornerstones on the side. And I want to come in behind this wall structure that sticks out and is encompassing the stairs, just by getting a little darker. Maybe add a little bit of cerulean to that wet shape, just to suggest that there's some nice deep dark shadows right along this edge here. And then on the other side, so that it feels like the facade cuts back, I'm going to come in with some darks now and just really darken this, clean my brush, and just soften those edges. Maybe add a little bit of the orange to that, just to warm it up. But now it makes that one little facade that's over where the arches are come forward, just by darkening the back corner, behind the back corner, that makes it recede. While we're working in this particular area, one of the things I can do is go ahead and put some a little bit of cobalt turquoise light with a little bit of what do you call it, yellow ochre, and create some green in a few spots. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to get a little bit of turquoise that's a deeper bluer turquoise for some of the shadow areas in this, just to make sure that some of it feels dark and some of it has some light. But now we have some plants that are actually I'm gonna put a little red in there just for fun. And that red is touching some of the wet area that had blue in it, is running. It's going to create a little bit of color on there. The plants in this courtyard that are behind the wall, in between the two buildings, I want to take a little bit of a darker color. In this case, it's like a turquoise, and I'm going to get a little bit of dark underneath some of the areas that are in shadow that are coming down this wall. I'll clean my brush, wipe all the water off my brush, and push a little bit of that damp brush into the edges, top edges of some of these shadow shapes. And maybe I'll just pull some of this down like it's shadows on the wall. So it's just sort of barely there. It just kind of softens that whole thing. And I can come back with maybe a little ultramarine and darks and get some of this dark in there. All right, now let's step back, lean back in your chair a little bit, kind of look at your painting, see how all the values are working together. I particularly like what I did up here because I softened this big dark shape with a little bit of a damp brush and blurred it up into the sky so we don't see such a hard transition. But we're going to come back in next and do the wall. And then we'll start on the water. But we've got two series of walls. We got one way in the back between these two buildings, and then we have the long wall that comes towards us. Let's talk a little bit about how we do a big shape that's like this. It's kind of trapezoidal, and it's vertical. It has a vertical plane to it, and it's got some breaks in the wall with some stone pillars supporting those little step out areas. So probably the best tool to be using is a flat brush. I'm going to use this big flat here. I'm going to bring back my reference for you. See this wall here? It's got a lot of raw umber in it. It's got a lot of ultramarine in it. It's got little bits of orange here and there when it's wet, and it's got some burnt sienna. So there's a lot of different colors. Nothing is really defined as far as stonework, but we know it's a stone wall. So that being said, what we want to do is start off pretty light back here in the back. And that means getting a little bit of raw umber and some cerulean blue, mix up a glaze, and just kind of come down underneath the parapet cap there's a cap there, and there's also some little shapes that are horizontal that are out there through these little breaks in the wall. And this is all just a giant puddle of water. And I'm just moving right down around these little vertical stones, horizontal stones that are at each one of the wall breaks. And this is just a big wash. We're going to come back in and define it quite a bit more, but I want to get this basic wet neutral shape in here, and I can always go back in and get a little bit more water, a little bit more, and I'm just really quickly filling in this with a wash. Now, as I get closer to the viewer, I'm picking up a little bit of whatever I had in my palette that had some burnt sienna in it. So it's transitioning to a warmer wash or glaze that is this whole shape. But now everything's wet. We got some skips in there, we got some dry brushing, but it's predominantly wet. And I can now come back and take and charge these things with other colors. So I'm going to get a little bit of cerulean blue, which is a little cooler, and I want to drop some of this into the wet area. I'll rinse my brush and maybe get a little bit of burnt sienna. Drop a little of that in there in a few spots. Then some raw umber all by itself. And we'll just kind of drop that in a couple of spots. And all this is so wet and my board is at a bit of an angle. You can see how it's starting to run down vertically across this surface. And I want to start getting a little cooler. So whatever I pick up is definitely going to be cooler, has just a touch of this Payne's gray in it. And let these colors just kind of move vertically down through this shape. And we'll let that dry for a minute or start to dry, and then we'll start adding additional colors. But right now it's too wet to do anything else. If I add more color to this, it's going to just turn to mud. So we want to just let this kind of settle down. Let all these colors blend by themselves. We've got some warms, we've got some cools, but if we try to do too much, it's going to sabotage it. So we want to just basically allow a little bit of cool, a little bit of warm to be in this puddle on the surface of the paper. But as this starts to settle down into the cotton fibers of the paper, that's when, if you add more color to this, it turns to mud. So we want to let it completely dry enough so that we can add some really dry pigments to this. But right now it's so wet that it'll sabotage us otherwise. So just be patient, get this initial wash down, maybe pull some of this dark up into some of the breaks within the stone parapet wall, just to break up that line. As we get underneath these stone caps, I'm going to pick up a little burnt sienna and Payne's gray, get a cooler dark, and I'm going to drop in a drier pigment with ultramarine, burnt sienna, maybe a little bit of Payne's gray, and I can drop this in just a couple of spots. And what it'll do is it defines like a shadow underneath these capstones. And I can always take a little drier cerulean blue in a couple of spots.
Randy, can you revise the colors for the wall, please?
It's a mixture of warms and cool neutrals. And what that means is we're starting with some raw umber mixed with a little cerulean blue to get these light grays back here. As we come forward and we get into this forward half of the wall, I used less of the cerulean blue and a little bit more of the raw umber, so it got warmer and warmer. As this whole wall shape got wet with pigment, and the pigment is running down vertically because of the angle of my board, I cleaned my brush and I introduced a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of orange, and then I came in with some darks underneath the wall cap So I now have a base color of that's very mottled and kind of soft, but it's neutral. Everything's neutral in here. It's got some warms, it's got some cools, but it's grays. And I don't just do a flat gray. I started with a cooler gray back here, and as I moved towards the viewer, it got increasingly warmer. As it's wet, all these little pigments started running vertically, and it created striations through there. So it has a runniness look to it, kind of a fluid look. And we're going to have to, we've got a break in the wall here, a break in the wall here, and a break in the wall here. So those are getting light. We've got to create little separations to make those darker where they recess back in. And we'll let this dry and come back in and do that. If you see that things are, pooling up here at the base of the wall and they're not following your drawing exactly, you can come back with the tip of your brush and kind of cheat a little bit and pull the pigment up into your line work so it aligns properly. I personally, I'm just going to soften the bottom of this wall shape. I'm taking my tip of my brush that's just slightly damp, and I'm just feathering this down into the water, because the wall goes through the water. It doesn't stop right at the surface of the water. So I'm just trying to soften the bottom edge of this, but not too much, because I want the water itself, when we start painting it, to be brilliantly, deep and dark and have a nice color to it. But if I have a real hard edge here, it's going to look like my wall is floating on top of the water instead of recessing into the water. So at this point, I've got to dry this. I hope you're all kind of having fun, kind of seeing how the pigments, the warms interact with the cools, and you start getting this neutral stone wall base coat established on the shape. And that's all it is a base coat. It's not, you're not doing the final painting here of this wall. We're going to do more to it, but we have to get this to dry so that the color stays brilliant, even in a neutral state. We don't want it to turn muddy. We want to see the warms. We want to see the cools. We want to feel those things. So I'm getting this nice and dry. Using the exact same colors that we did before, but a little lighter in value. I want to, and maybe a little cooler, more on the cerulean blue side. I'm going to come back here and do this wall back here that's way behind these buildings. And then as it gets down closer to the water, it gets a little bit darker. I'm using just a little bit more cerulean blue with some, what do you call it? Some burnt sienna. Rinse my brush, use that color, pull it over to the edge of this building here, and just allow this cooler neutral to establish our far wall. It's way back there in the background. Okay. This is warmer than that. It's subtle, but by the time we're done, it'll feel like this is much closer to us than that one. All right, I'm always checking my shapes to see how wet they are. This one feels pretty dry. I'm going to give it one last shot before I go back in and start establishing my edges. I'm going to come back with some of the same pigment that I used on this far wall. It's got burnt sienna and cerulean blue. And I'm going to create a little separation here. Clean my brush, add a little bit of warmth to it. And just create a shadowy break in the wall there. So now we've actually broken up, this big stone wall with some shape cuts. And then I want to get a little bit of a yellow ochre down at the base here. clean my brush. And that just kind of fills into any part of this that's still damp. All right, we'll let that dry. I'm adding a little bit of dark in here just to really push the value changes so that we see that this is actually cutting back into that stone surface of that facade of the wall. Then as we kind of come down these little pillars, I want to get these a little darker. So we'll just put a little wash on here just to show that there's a corner there. And then at the base, make this a little darker. And you can see I'm not worried about the bottom of this. I just want it to feather away into the water. I just want to give a little suggestion that there's some dark along the base of this stone wall. And I'll just clean my brush and just soften the top edge of those brush strokes. So it just kind of all blends into the wall. It's just darker bits of stone along that wall. And then I can always take a little cerulean blue, come back in here with some marks. And I'm just going to take a squirt gun, my little misting bottle, and just mist this a little bit. So it softens this in granule. Because I've used burnt sienna, I've used raw umber and ultramarine blue with that, it starts to granulate. And it just gives a real kind of textured, organic look to it. And the base of the wall tends to get a little darker, a little more weathered, darkened down here at the base than it does at the top. See if we can get a little bit more of the ultramarine in there. And then I'll just hit it again with a little. All this mist does, the misting bottle does, is it just lifts that pigment and softens it and feathers it a little so that we don't see any hard edges. We just feel the shape of everything getting a little darker. I'm going to add a little dark right in here. All right. We'll let that dry. Once you've got that done, I'm going to do a little cleanup somewhere in here. I have to find a brush that is stiff enough and short enough that I can do a little bit of lifting. I've got a nice little 1/2-inch short bristled brush that when it's wet or just slightly damp, I can come back in here and take the edges where I kind of overshot my my edge of this wall cap and just soften. I don't necessarily want to lose the color. I just don't want, I want to lose the hard edges of those brush strokes so that we feel a little bit of warmth on the top of that wall cap. And then the edge of it is a little brighter, or vice versa. I haven't decided, but I just want to go back and clean things up a little bit. Let's see. Everybody caught up at this point? They feel like their wall is coming together?
Not quite.
Okay, well, we got plenty of time. What I want to do is make sure that whatever you painted on this wall gets dry before we do it. As we build up layers of stone, if you keep painting this while it's damp, it'll turn into a big muddy mess. But all the subtleties of the warms and the cools will come shining through this wall if you dry it between each step. And I mean completely dry. That's the beauty of watercolor, is knowing, when you get it nice and dry, you can glaze another, say you've got a cool base, you can glaze a warm glaze over the top of it, and you'll feel the depth of those pigments. But if you try to do it all at once, it'll just turn to mud. So that's the key to that. Now, let's see, we want to get, make sure it's dry. Come back in with a smaller brush, and let's start building up some warms. I'm going to put a little bit of orange down on some of this here, and then a saturated orange maybe in a couple spots in here, and maybe a little bit of warmth in the base of one of these. Take a smaller brush, just a round, and soften those marks. Don't leave them real obvious what they are. Just give us a hint that there's some warmth there. And that's kind of all we need to do. We're going to dry that. Allow that to dry. And come back with a bigger flat, like your 1 inch, and get yourself some ultramarine blue. Mix it with whatever you've got in your palette that's cool, maybe a little cerulean blue or something, and just come back in and put a couple of brush strokes in here that suggest rock shapes. Get a little raw umber in there. Come back with that. See how dark that is? It's a big oily, swatch of brush stroke in there. And then I'm going to come back in with a little bit of dark right back in here. And just feather that up to the next pillar. But don't get too far back, because we're not going to see much detail farther back. It's all right here in the foreground where we see all this stuff happening. So you could take a misting bottle and you can kind of soften some of these little marks that you've just made. They become stonework. Maybe we've actually got some really nice deep darks in a few spots with some just little crevice shadows. But then I would soften those marks so that they're not real obvious. All right, that's about all we need to do there. Now, while we're waiting for that to dry, I'm just going to take whatever dark I have here in my palette. I'm going to come back in and put a few little doors and just a little more definition into some of these window shapes back here, just to suggest a little more depth. I'm going to put a really dark, little burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, fairly oily. And I'm going to come back in here and just create the top of this little lamp post. So we can actually see it. It stands out now. And then using, a small brush or a rigger, whatever you've got, get a little bit of these same darks, a little ultramarine blue, some burnt sienna, and let's just create a little bit of dark where some of these windows are. Don't try to be too definite or defined with these windows. They're just slashes of dark. That's all you need. A little bit of dark in here. Leave a little bit of lighter area for the sills, or not the sills, the mullions. I'm just kind of dropping in some darks there to suggest what we've got going. I'll take a little bit of orange on the tip of my brush and come in underneath this where the window openings are. And we'll just create a little bit of warmth where the recess is. And then we've got more dark with some little interesting little things in the window. And then they've got these interesting windows that are up in the shadow areas. And I'm not trying to be too decisive with these. I'm just trying to put a dark mark in here where these window openings are. And then over in here, we'll put a little bit of window here. And these are just rough little marks of dark, very random, not too defined, just to create contrast with the facade, to suggest that there's a little recess in the building and there's darks in there that are windows. I'll get some real darks to do that lamp later, but for now, I'm just going to come in and put a little bit of shadowing under some of these breaks in the stone. We'll throw this in here. It just helps define the fact that there's some breaks in that big long line. I'm going to get a little bit of cerulean blue and just keep it pretty diluted, and just come across the edge of this stonework just to suggest that there's some shadow on the side of that. It's just very quick. You just put a little bit of a slash of cool compared to the top part of the surface, which is getting full sun, and all of a sudden we feel the shape and dimension of that. We can do the same on these little stone platforms out here. So now we've got pretty much 3/4 of our painting done. It's about time to start working on our water and the mist in the back. So I'm going to give you a chance to finish what I just did. If you want, you can do your door as well. I'm going to use a little bit of kind of a neutralized or blued grayed down dark for my doorway. Just throw some dark in here. And then up in the top, I'll get a little bit of ultramarine and drier ultramarine and burnt sienna. And I'll make the top of this door a little darker than down below. And as the water kind of runs down a little bit, it'll start blending and we'll start to see different amounts. I'm going to put a little bit of red or something in parts of this door to suggest that there might be some raised panels or recessed panels in that doorway. And then I can always come back with a really lighter value of the orangey facade color and just create the depth of that door opening. Come in underneath some of these with that same color. Get a little darker right underneath this guy's facade. Maybe there's windows in there. All right, we'll let you finish that up. Next step is going to be the water. And why I was being quiet there is I was just thinking about how we're going to approach this. And I think if everybody's ready, we'll start talking a little bit about our step-by-step process for this. We're going to wet this area, just dampen it a little bit. It doesn't need to be soaking wet, but I think it's since this part is going to be wet and wet, if you take clean water on a clean brush and you just start dropping in some vertical strokes so that you're dampening the paper, and come in underneath this building that we haven't even really addressed yet, the one that is kind of in the middle there, but just get the paper vertical strokes of wet. Let that just kind of settle down. It doesn't have to be perfect, but just we don't want it soaking. We want a little bit of dampness. And I'm going to take a little bit of my Winsor blue and get a nice, deep, rich mix of that. And I'm going to bring my palette over, my camera over so you can see what I'm doing here with this. It's pretty dark. And we're going to be adding different colors to this, but this is our base color. We want to make sure our brush is fully charged with a nice mixture of this deep, dark, kind of greenish looking blue. That's what Winsor blue is. And I want to get right up underneath the wall and just make vertical strokes. Make sure they're vertical. You can leave a few spaces in between. They don't have to be absolutely perfect, but as we get closer and closer to the corner down here, I want to drop in some burnt sienna. I want to get behind this wall and get a dark. So it looks like this little pillar thing has got some lighter areas in it, and get drier Windsor blue on your brush, and just come down with some vertical strokes. And then clean your brush, get most of that color off, and then just use this to fill in this damp area, and just start dropping in vertical strokes so that they all kind of feather together. This comes up a little bit, and then we'll maybe get a little bit of turquoise in here in a couple places. We'll get some orange in here in a couple places. I want to get some new gamboge right in here, or gamboge rather, to really, and it'll repel whatever you've done here. It'll leave a really bright kind of yellowy, warm yellow in there. I'm going to take that smaller brush that I had. If you've got a round, you can do it with a round, but just come down with a clean, damp brush and wipe away some of that really rich, dark color that was in the water. And then come down around the edge of this wall and define that. So it leaves a little bit of a white area where the wall is, and in this recess where the water goes back behind these buildings, allow that to get a little darker, and bring it down vertically. Over here at the side, all this yellow has kind of run off the side of my paper, so I'm going to come back in and get some darker darks in here. A little bit of greenish, that yellow and the blue combines to make a little bit of green. I'm going to get some golden green in here. I'm going to get a little bit of the turquoise color in here, and then some true orange in a couple spots. And then I'll just take my squirt gun, this little misting bottle, and just give it a quick little squirt. Take some tissue and wick up along the bottom, so it just keeps pulling that pigment down towards the bottom of the page. And you should be able to have it board at enough of an angle so that this water just keeps pulling downward. I want to get a little bit more green effect in here, so I'm going to add a little bit of blue turquoise. It's a turquoise color. Get a little of that in there. And then where this got dark up here, I'm going to clean my brush completely. I'm going to get a little something under it so it isn't running vertically. And I'm going to start dropping in clean water right up in here. This clean water should start repelling some of that. And you may have to just hold your hand under the edge of this to control the angle, because you may want more angle, you may want less angle, depending on what gravity does. But you want to start dropping in little droplets of pure water so that it blooms against this darker pigment. And you can come back in with a little bit drier Windsor blue in a couple places and drop that in. And where you've got this Windsor blue dropped in, and then water, pure water, what's going to happen is it will start repelling that dark color. And I'm just going to keep working in wet, pure water, and allow that to repel that rich dark. And you can always come back in with a little bit of a brush and hit it vertically a little bit to change up the values. I want to get a little bit more light in here where this vertical is. So I'm just lifting a little bit of that wet, dark pigment away. And then along the bottom of the paper, I'm just going to hit it with a bit of mist. And then we'll just take our tissue and start dabbing a little bit of this up at the back here. And you'll find that as you drop in water, you'll be able to lift and soften that so it feels like mist rising. And then what I didn't tell you is that we're going to get some of that yellow ochre and come in with the top of this facade, clean our brush, lift our board angle so it's sloping away from us, and then just touch the bottom edge of that with a little bit of water so that it starts to soften and blend in with the this area that's lifting, and we're starting to feel a misty effect. So I can take my brush, a fairly just slightly damp brush, almost dry, and I can twist it a little bit, and I can lift a little bit of that value off of the wet and wet surface to create a misty effect. And I'm going to come back in with clean water and just drop it into this area that I want to be fairly white. And I can actually give the effect of all this color just fading into the mist. So we start to feel like it's just kind of softening a little bit. Noise. Hit it with a little bit of just half of a spray. And then I would take a little bit of cerulean blue, perhaps. Drop a little of that in here. It's cooler. It's going to feel farther away than these dark, rich colors in the foreground. And if you just tap it with just a touch of this mist, it raises that pigment off the surface of the paper and it feathers it out and softens it. So it just feels like it's not quite there. It gives you that atmospheric effect. And you can always add a little bit more water. I'm going to add some dry gamboge with some yellow ochre right in here. I want this to feel like there's a little bit of a reflection, and then come back with a darker, drier dark around this, some of these areas in here. We'll get a little richer dark. And I'm going to let this, I'll hit it with a mist bottle, and it just raises that pigment off the surface and allows it to flow a little bit more. Now, I do want this to be much lighter over on this side, so I'm just going to hit this and allow some of it to run off the page. It's just a matter of getting the values right. And by letting some of this roll off the surface, I can come back and focus over on the left side with drier pigment. And I'm going to get burnt sienna and Windsor blue. And I want this to be even darker. I want this to really be pretty dark. And then we can add some orange. Just see what happens when you put a little bit of dark in a couple of these places. And I'm just going to turn it sideways and let this just all feather and roll and just kind of soften. And because I want it to be darkest down towards the bottom of the page, which is closer to the viewer. And that's what our objective is to get that dark coming down close. And I'll add a little bit of turquoise green here. It's a dark turquoise. Pull that up into this area that is going to have water in it. And then I want to get a little bit of dark behind this building here to make sure that this dark reads above the mist. So I've got to feather this into the building facade, clean my brush and just soften it. add a little bit of water. And I think you can, hopefully you're seeing that when you add a little bit of water where there's dark pigment, it repels the pigment and leaves these blooms that start taking over and becoming more organic. And you can take your brush, if your brush is clean, and you can pick up some of that pigment and really create a lighter area where you're trying to create the impression of rising mist. And so I'm just creating this so that it's coming out of that. Now I'm going to pick up just a little bit of ultramarine blue and drop in just a little bit. So it feels like there's little shadows of this blue underneath some of that mist. Clean my brush, soften those brush strokes because everything's pretty wet here anyway. But that little bit of ultramarine blue really pushes things back a little, and it starts to feel like it's undercutting some of that rising mist. All right. Now we got to let this dry before we can put any ripples and things like that into it. So I'm just wicking up the bottom of this. That's helping accelerate some of the downward movement. I'm going to pull up a little, just with the edge of a clean, damp brush, I can kind of create little riplets or reflections in the water. It's hard to get when you're painting, to get your brain to work with what you're saying. If you have something really dark like this and you happen to touch and lift a little bit of it, it feels like we're seeing part of that wall beneath the surface. It's just lighter, slightly lighter in value than the rest of the water. Now, this is where you have to watch the surface of the shine of this paper. If you start to see it losing its shine, that's when it's time to put a few of these little ripples in, but we're not there yet. We need to get a little darker in a couple of spots here. I'm going to come back in and just get some darker. Your ripples won't show up unless this is pretty dark. So I'm adding a little bit darker along the bottom of the water. And that will help bring that water closer to the viewer. And then we'll get a little bit more of the turquoise in here. We'll add a little of that. There we go. And I'm going to dry this while you're finishing painting. I'm done with this at this point. I don't want to dry it all the way. I just want to lose a little bit of that shine so I can lift with the edge of my brush some of these little ripples. I don't want them to all be exactly spaced the same distance apart, but I want to have a clean brush, no paint in it, and then mostly the water's mostly wrung out of it, so it's just damp. And I can come back in here and I can kind of create just some very slight little, and between each one of these, I rinse my brush and I squeeze it out, and I'll put a few more of these little ripples in, and you can kind of lift just enough of that dark pigment in places to suggest that we've got some ripples. And as they go back into the distance, they're going to get closer together because they're getting farther away, right? And you don't want to put too many in because then it's like overkill. So just a few in a couple places is really what you want. I'm going to get one or two that are a little brighter than others. So we'll get this one a little brighter, maybe one in here a little brighter. And I think that's it. I don't really want to do much more than that, because we're going to splatter a little bit of paint on there once it dries to give it some sparkle of light reflecting on the moving water. But for now, we've got it pretty dark. We've got a little bit of verticality to it where the water's run downhill. I want to get some darks just to suggest where the base of this far distant building is. So I'm going to get some burnt sienna, mix it with some of the blues on my palette, and just kind of touch the bottom of this with a little bit of dark. maybe a little bit of dark back in here. And then take my round that's clean and just slightly damp. And I want to get a little bit of burnt sienna, or I'm sorry, burnt raw umber, and just give a little taste of softer wet and wet beneath that dark, so that it feels like we're seeing it through the water. And I'm going to put a little bit of the green on the building just to suggest that there might be, you know, some other colors in there that we're seeing through the mist. And I like that turquoise with the orange. It just has a nice cohesiveness to it that may or may not be there in reality, but it makes it more painterly, more fun. And now we've got these windows. I'm going to get my burnt sienna and some of my blue that's really dry. And I'm just going to drop a little of this in here and create the suggestion of some windows. And then I'll clean my brush, wipe all the water off so it's just slightly damp. And I'm going to tickle the bottom edge of these so that warm, dark color comes down. We don't necessarily see the bottom of these window openings, but we feel that it kind of gets down into the mist there a little bit. We can even take some darker darks and create the darks at the top a little more defined, like that. All right, now using that same color, I'm going to get a rigger, and I'm going to pick up that burnt sienna and the Windsor blue, the phthalo blue. I want to make sure it's fairly dark, fairly dry, not really sloppy wet. And I'm going to come back in and I'm going to just kind of suggest where the edge of these barrel tiles are along the edge of this this roof line. And then I can do the same thing over here. I'm going to just sort of give us a little definition with some darks. And underneath here as well, we'll just get a little bit of dark in there. Clean my brush, get some burnt sienna on it that's just kind of orangey, a little darker than orange, and use that to kind of define where this recess is. It's a little darker back in here, and we might have just a couple of angular lines to suggest that there's barrel roof tiles coming down the slope. That's too dark, so we'll just take a wet brush and just kind of use that pigment to kind of break it up. And then do the same thing over here. And then underneath, I want this to be a little bit darker. Same over here. We're going to have a little bit of a recess of reflected light up in underneath this. And I can just use the tip of my brush here to just put a couple of little lines to indicate the directionality of these barrel tiles without getting too defined. Now we got that really white, kind of obnoxious fence back there. We got to knock that down. So I'm going to take my brush, I'm going to clean all the water out of it. And I'm just going to take some of that dark pigment that's in the background and pull it over parts of that fence. We'll leave a few of the little whites out there, but basically I'm just kind of glazing over it with whatever pigment was already there. We still see it as a light shape, but it's not nearly as important as that was originally. I want to get just a touch of just some sandy color, beige, whatever, just on part of this lamppost. We'll use some color from our palette that's just junk color, and add just a touch of shadow underneath that cap on the light. I'm looking around at my painting, seeing what we've got. We've got to let this water dry. We're not done quite yet, but we've got some nice things happening here. We can still come back in once this dries and put a few more darks in. So I'm drying this to make sure we're all dry. And in our wall, perhaps we'll get a little bit darker up here at the top with a small flat. And I might just get a little bit of raw umber and whatever darks are in my palette and get underneath this a little bit with some stonework, a couple of spots, maybe get some dry brush across here, a little bit of Payne's gray, some cool color in here, and just give a kind of a scratchy dry brush effect across that wall, just right in the immediate foreground. Let the rest of the wall get lighter as it moves away. It's not quite as important. We do have the return wall back there. It's not all that significant, but I want to get a little bit of dark behind this return. And then the wall cap itself in the back, I'm just going to take some of the color from the background and just drag it across there just to soften that a little bit. I think that's not bad. Now we've got this lamp over here, and I've got some nice rich darks. I'm going to take a combination of the burnt sienna, the Windsor blue, and Payne's gray. And I'm just going to do a little bit of dark up in here just to kind of suggest the shape of this thing. And then using a little bit of the raw umber, or I'm sorry, the yellow ochre, and whatever happens to be in my palette, I may come down off of this with a little bit of shadowing. And then we'll let that dry, and then I've got a handrail that goes across up these stairs, it's a little wrought iron thing. So we'll use the darks that we use for the light post and or the light deal. And I'm just gonna put a little suggestion of a lamp, of a handrail on there. And then in the wall, in the door, maybe we've got some little recessed panels. We'll just throw a few of those in. Because our water is still really, really wet. So one of the things I wanted to do is come back in and put some dry darks in here in just a couple of spots. But I want to make sure that this is, and it's really only in here that I want to focus these darks, because that's part of our center of interest. So I'll come back in with my flat and get some Windsor blue and a little bit of the burnt sienna. And I just want to kind of get a little bit of dry brush effect going on. And then we'll just soften that. All right, that really darkened up a couple of these little areas here, right in the immediate foreground. We'll dry that, and then I'm going to mix up a little bit of white gouache, and we'll sprinkle a little of that over the water only. And it will give the appearance of, just sparkling water with sunlight on it. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'll take I got this junk brush. It's an old oil brush, and it's boar's bristles on it. And I don't want to get it wet. I just want to get it just slightly damp. And I may drop it into the raw umber and whatever I've got here. And I'm just going to kind of scrunch this over some of the stuff inside these arches, just to give me kind of a dry brush and textured effect inside there. Get a little bit more water on there and get some burnt sienna, a little bit of blue in there. It's too dark. And we'll just kind of dry brush this just to suggest that there's texture on those walls in there. All right. I think that's good. White gouache. I don't put it in my palette because if I do, it will contaminate everything. So I have a little side palette that I use, and it's I just squirt a little bit of white gouache into it. I just did a little bit right there. You can kind of see it, and I'll take my rigger and I'll just work some of this paint into my rigger so it's not real wet, but wet enough so that the water will drip off and the paint will drip off of it. Step the palette aside, and I can just kind of tap my rigger very slightly. I'm holding it clear out on the end, kind of very lightly, and I just lightly tap this in a couple spots. And that little bit of white speckles just enlivens the watery area a little bit. And I can take that same pigment and I use a little bit smaller brush, kind of a little, I don't know what you call it, a calligraphy brush. Get a little bit of white gouache on that. And I've elected to sign this over here. And there we go. Hard to, helps if it's a little bit darker, but that's okay. So that is the direction for a little courtyard facade Italian village, Bagno Vignoni, and with the hot springs. And we've lost everything back here because of the water we added. And it just transitions into this really dark water down in the foreground. We've got a few little indications of ripples coming towards us. But the center of interest, which was one of the first questions that was asked, is this facade right here. This is our center of interest. It's our dominant shape. It's the most important part of the painting. Everything else recedes away from it. Even the background, even though we've got some hard silhouette edges against that light sky, I lost some of the edges by taking a damp brush and blending it up into the sky. Corner transitions where the light can't get around the corner, very important to change the values. Go from a really light facade to a dark facade, having a little bit of shadow underneath these overhangs. All of those things, a little bit of a recess back in here between these two buildings. You don't have to define everything, just put a little bit of value that's darker than the rest of it, and it feels like it's pushing back. Where I had a little bit of a fence or something up in here, I just pulled some of the value from that dark background trees across it without having to actually paint it. We still see stuff going on back there, but it's no longer takes on the importance that it once did. The warmth that we have in this facade up here closest to us is the warmest part of the painting. We have a little bit of a bounced reflection of that same warmth down here in the water, but the water creates a nice value contrast against the stone wall, which is a neutral, but the neutral isn't just a neutral gray. We go from a cool neutral to a medium neutral to a warm neutral. There's a transition across there. And even when we came back in and put some darker marks in after we'd let it dry, I squirted it with a little mist so that it feathered and lifted those edges and softened them. And it just all kind of makes a nice neutral, soft stone facade that doesn't upstage our buildings. The buildings are really what are important with these little arches back here. But if you have any pencil lines that are still showing, you want to get rid of them and you haven't painted over them, you can always go back with an eraser and lift anything, and all of a sudden those little white ticks of light on the stairs tend to pop off, and we see them a little bit more defined when you get rid of the pencil line. But that pretty much is the complete painting and how we got there.